Hello, everybody. It's Stephen and Walter here for another episode of So Chatty, or as Walter likes to call it, So Catty, whatever. And it is episode number 42. And today we're going to talk all about the problems you might have with patterns, or at least the problems that we have had with patterns in the past. And maybe for some of you that might be new garment sewers or new into quilting, these are some things you might find of interest. And for many of you that have been doing this for a while, I'm sure you have come across a lot of these problems with patterns, because not all patterns are the same. So let's jump right into, and these aren't really in any particular order. They're just, I brainstormed with myself, and Walter will jump in here with his thoughts. I'll look at it from a quilter's point of view. He'll look at it from a garment sewist point of view. And so the first thing is, I found when I first got into quilting, and I still find this a problem at times, is know the short forms, because pattern makers love to use abbreviations for everything. I'm not sure if there's a lot of them in sewing, but in like garment making, but in quilting, there's all kinds. We have HSTs, WOF, SNF, and a pile of other ones. I'm not going to explain what these abbreviations mean, but if a pattern is written well, they should not make the assumption that the person using the pattern knows what these short forms mean. For example, it took me a while to catch on to what WOF meant. Oof.
That's used in regular clothing patterns too.
It just means with the fabric, but having known what that term means, do you know what it really means? With the fabric, for a new person coming into this, it means from salvage to salvage. When the fabric is put on a bolt, it is usually folded in half from the salvage edges. The salvage edges are the parts that I guess they attach to the loom or to the printing roller or whatever for creating the fabric. And they are parallel to the grain of fabric, which I think Walter's kind of going to mention about why that's important to know grain of fabric and that later on. And it's usually folded in half. So with the fabric means from salvage to salvage, which is anywhere between 42 to 44 inches, depending on the manufacturer.
That's if you're using quilting cotton.
Yes.
But if you're using garment fabric, it can be 45 inches wide, or it could be 60 inches wide.
Okay, so there's a lot of variation there. But the important point is, and we're not going to get into talking about these variations, the important point here that I'm making is know what the terminology is, what the abbreviations mean, because they'll use them throughout a pattern. Now, a good pattern will tell you right off the bat, right on the first page, probably at the top, before they even get into the cutting instructions or anything else, they'll turn around and will tell you, here are the short forms that we will be using in this pattern. Here's what they mean. So as soon as you see that, and even if you're an experienced quilter or sewer, you should really pay attention to that. And it's good to know that it's right there on the front page, first page, because if you forget, you can go back and refer to it. The other day I came across one I didn't know, SNF. I had no idea what that was. And they didn't really explain it in the pattern. They just had NSF. I did find out that it meant a stitch and flip, which is a technique in quilting. But that was new. I had not come across that before, believe it or not.
Yeah, the other thing that's big in garment sewing is that you have to know which is your right side of your fabric and which is your wrong side of your fabric.
Oh, you do too in quilting.
Yeah.
And you'll often see that listed as RST, right sides together, at least in quilting. And of course, the right side of your fabric is usually the one that has the pretty side. They call it the pretty side. But sometimes certain fabrics, you don't know what the right side is, and it doesn't matter. In batiks, for example, most time with batiks, there isn't a right side. Both sides are the same.
Sometimes it's hard to tell with batiks, but sometimes there is a significant difference, so you really kind of need to have a good idea which side. The other thing that's hard to tell is canvas type fabrics. They're often hard to tell which side.
But we're going off topic.
Yeah, okay, fine.
This is not the scope of this
All right.
about how to find a right side of a fabric. No,
but you should know which of it.
But going back to abbreviations, that is RST. Okay. So, and you will see that a lot. That's pretty fundamental to it. So, yeah, make sure there's an explanation for that. Okay. Next thing is, and I'm bad for this because I don't do it and I should. They always tell you read the pattern all the way through before you start something. Now, I skim them usually, but I am infamous for getting halfway through a pattern going, ooh, I probably should have read about that before I got there. The reason being is sometimes they give you some tips or techniques, but they don't necessarily fall at the beginning of the pattern. They may be somewhere in the middle, or there'll be a little sidebar or something like that. And if you haven't read the pattern fully, you could miss something that may be of great help to you, or it could also be the difference between, frustration and success as well. And I would imagine that goes with garment
Yeah,
sewing.
I'm sort of a weird garment sewer because a lot of my garments I've done through a class, so I've had the teacher does the pattern reading, and actually I've really only ever really gone back to the pattern when I've had to go back and check it or for something like that or whatever. So I'm not really a good judge of that.
Well, I'm not either because I just kind of barrel ahead. And, I think there's a lot of people out there that do that because you're excited about getting started with this project. And, it's like when you get a new toy, a new electronic device or something, I always believe reading manuals is on a need to know basis. I just like to jump right in. And, I think this is sort of off topic, but I think that's what a lot of manufacturers have figured out, that people don't read the manual. So they often will enclose a quick guide, a quick start guide, they call it. They don't really have something like that when it comes to patterns, though. So, yeah, they're boring to read. And I get very impatient with them. But there have been times when I got to a point and I thought, ooh, I really should have done what they said and read the pattern with it.
And patterns can be inconsistent between manufacturers, especially
Oh,
for
yeah.
apparel.
Well, yeah, and that's part of what we're talking about in this today. The overall fact is no two patterns are alike. Usually, it depends on the company making them. It depends on the designer. Some patterns are written very, very well, very clearly, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Others are just a jumbled mess, and I have some examples of those kind of things, and I think Walter does too. But another thing when you're reading your pattern, you should do another strategy is highlight potential problems in the instructions or anything that you think might give you a problem. Because if you highlight those and after you finish reading the pattern, before you start to cut your fabric and everything, I would go searching on YouTube or Google for instructions on how to do certain things. For example, in a quilt once I had a pattern that said, okay, miter your borders. That's all it said. It didn't say how to miter the borders, and I wasn't sure. And there are a couple of different methods you can use for it. So I did a search on YouTube, and I found lots of videos that showed me very clearly how to do mitered borders. But the pattern did not tell me that. And it would have been very easy for me to have just said, the hell with it, I'm not doing mitered borders. I'm just going to do my regular borders kind of a thing. Well, that takes away from the final product and could give you a bit of a problem as well, depending on the rest of the design. So, if you go through it and you highlight the things you're not really clear about, then do a little research before you ever start working on the pattern. I think it'll save you a lot of headaches. What do you think?
In clothing patterns, sometimes there's some clothing patterns that will make assumptions as to what level of sewing you are. If you're somebody has a lot of experience or doesn't have a lot of experience, like I know one pattern I was referring to I was at the tail end of a shirt, and some shirts will tell you the spacing between the buttons and how to put the buttons on and things like that. Well, this manufacturer just listed, okay, all you have to do now is put your buttons on, and then and your shirt will be done. Well, if somebody's never sewn a shirt before, they may not know how to space them or something like that, and
Or
they
how to get them lined up with the
or get them
buttonhole.
lined up or something like that. So that sort of left you up in the air, like. So I mean, I happen to know how to put the buttons on because I've been taught how to do it, um, but if somebody's just bought the pattern and they've never really sewn a shirt before, that may not be, or that's not a good. I don't think that's a good thing to have in the pattern.
No, and that brings up the whole point that I have here too is after you've highlighted your potential problems, you might want to seek out additional information. Look at your pattern. If you're having trouble understanding something in that pattern, there is usually a website associated with that pattern. In this day and age, when a lot of patterns you can download as PDFs, you could go to the website, or even a website where you ordered a physical copy of the pattern. They may have tutorials. They may have YouTube videos about that, and they may link them right through by way of their website. And especially when I found this really helpful when I was starting to make bags, because I was doing bags from, well, by Annie, one of the best companies for instructions in terms of making bags, because those patterns are very, very detailed. They're like reading a small book, but they're also linked up with YouTube videos where they show you some of the techniques. And I found that really helpful on some of the more complex bags. I'm talking about the ones, not so much a tote, but more like, bags that have sections, dividers in them that are lined, they have inside pockets, things like that. So look for resources that might be listed already with your pattern, or look for the website that the pattern came from. You may find additional information there.
Yeah, there's some the clothing manufacturers, especially the ones that are clothing pattern manufacturers, especially the ones that are producing electronic copies like PDF copies, often have tutorials on how to put the garment together. So yeah, it's worthwhile having a look for those.
Yeah. So, again, this all comes back from a careful reading of the pattern as well. Because, yeah, you could hit a lot of frustration at certain points in the pattern that it's just going to turn you right off from making whatever it is you're trying to make. Now, Walter also mentioned about the level of expertise with patterns. Some patterns will tell you it's for a beginner, confident beginner, intermediate, advanced. Well, okay, that's a good guide, but all that is a guide. Because if you've been sewing for a while or quilting for a while, you probably know what you can handle and what you can't handle. But if you're a rank beginner, look for that on a pattern, because not to scare you off, but there's a reason why they put those things on there. I mean, if you've never done anything in quilting beyond sew 4 squares of fabric together, you might not be ready to do a mariner's compass, okay, or a New York Beauty. All right, those would be considered very advanced formats. And don't jump the gun. The reason being is the more advanced the pattern is, the more the pattern maker may assume you know, and so may not explain certain things. They may say, okay, now do a Y seam here, or an inset triangle here. And you're going to look at it and go, what the heck's an inset triangle? How do I do that? That pattern might be a little bit beyond you. Put it to the side. Go for something a little bit more simple. Build your skill over time. What about on sewing garments?
I think garments, I would like to see patterns written that are for that a beginner can use, especially for a garment. But they're not always written that way. Sometimes there's assumptions made that you, like the buttons and things like that you already know how to do. And that's not always a good thing on these patterns. And some of them can be written in such a way that they're difficult to understand. So there's a certain amount of experience that you need just to try and decipher the pattern.
Well, if you've ever tried to write a pattern, and I have, but not commercially, just for myself, it is a lot more involved than you would think. There's a lot of factors involved. One, I think that a good pattern writer is someone who assumes that whoever picks up the pattern, doesn't matter what their level is, write it from a beginner's point of view. Or like kill them with over detail, of too much detail. I think it's better that way because a beginner, I think, will appreciate the detail. An advanced sewer can skim over that. But if it's not there, then a beginner or somebody who's never done a certain technique or tried something like this before may be confused. The other thing is English. If the pattern's written in English, and the ones we use are for obvious reasons. And this gets my goat because I was an English teacher. I hate bad grammar in a pattern. If you do not write clear sentences, if your syntax is wrong, if you leave out words or something, you are going to confuse somebody because that's key to it. This is a form of writing. So it needs to be edited, it needs to be proofread several times, and it needs to have been reviewed by somebody else who didn't write the pattern. And many pattern makers do that. They'll send their pattern to somebody else they'll send it to several people. They may have one person who actually does the proofreading and the editing of the actual English that's in there, the instructions. Another person will be a pattern tester, and they'll get the pattern and actually make the object that's in there. And as they're doing it, they will write notes as to, well, maybe you should have put this in, or this was confusing here, and that, so that the pattern can be rewritten. And that's a time-consuming process. But anybody who makes their living from writing patterns and writes them well, and they're very popular, that's what they do. But some don't. Don't you have one?
I have one example of actually just a shirt I was making the other day, and I was placing the placket on the sleeve, and the pattern was reading that you have to place this placket in a certain way so that one part of it is facing the front side of the sleeve. Well, the part I'd see if you're a beginner is how do you identify what the front side of the sleeve is, right? I know how to do it because I've done a lot of times. I've put in the sleeves before. I know how to identify the front side of the sleeve. But a true beginner may be sitting there scratching their head and go, what's the front side of the sleeve? And I sometimes forget myself which side identifies the front side of the sleeve. So I went leafing through the booklet to try and figure out where it said this is the front side of the sleeve. And I couldn't find it in the booklet. So I had to go looking elsewhere again just to make sure that what I had thought in my mind is correct. So stuff like that.
So you see, that's a good example of what I said earlier, in that some pattern writers assume you know more than you know, and that's not good for writing patterns. Now, another strategy you can try too is, now this is more maybe for quilting than it is for garment making, make a sample block. If you've never done this particular block that the quilt calls for, it might not hurt to do a sample one, so you can get a feel for how it's going to go together. I mean, if it all goes together and it's fine, you haven't wasted any fabric. But if you
say that again, sorry.
Why is your watch talking to us?
I don't know, because you must have said something that...
Well, I don't know. I didn't say its name. But anyways, you might want to do a sample out of scrap fabric as well if you're unsure. So you're not wasting, your good fabric for what you're making. So samples are good. Don't you do something like that when you do a muslin?
Yeah, well, I've only ever really done one muslin, but you can create a sample garment that's very basic. You may not have things like zippers or pockets or something like that in it. You've just made it from the pattern really quick just to make sure that it fits properly.
So kind of the same way, so that you're not wasting good fabric on something
and
that
you
you're not
use
sure on.
cheap fabric or something.
Now, a lot of people probably don't like to do that though, because it's time consuming. It adds time to it. But it's not a race when you're making these things. If it is a race for you, there's a problem. You set a deadline that's unrealistic, or you left it to the last minute and you need that gift kind of a thing, and that's when you make mistakes. when you're rushing through these things. Ask me how I know. Because I do. So, another strategy might be, before you begin, make sure you have all the supplies the pattern calls for. Now, another good sign of a well-written quilting pattern is that they usually will put on the very last page a detailed breakdown of the fabrics that you're going to need and other supplies. Now, they often put them on the back pages because the paper patterns, ones that you actually buy in a quilting store, are sealed in a plastic bag. And so, one, for the store owner, they don't want you taking the pattern out of the bag and looking at it, because you're going to dog-ear the pattern and then they can't sell it. So manufacturers of patterns have gotten smart, and they print that basic information on the back of the pattern so you can walk around the store or whatever and start to buy the fabrics based on what's on the back of that. So that's a good thing. But there have been times when I have worked through a pattern, thought I had everything laid out for it, what I needed, and found out when I got halfway through the pattern, there was something missing. Like, this often happens when you have to cut pieces. I sometimes, although I'm changing my method on this, I like to cut all of my pieces out before I start and label everything. And then I can start putting the pieces together, and I don't have to stop to cut anymore. But there can be a problem with that. Again, this goes back to also reading the pattern all the way through. I have cut all my pieces and then realized that there was a subcut somewhere that the pattern left out. What I mean by subcut is it may have said you had to cut so many strips at a certain width and length, and then it's a subcut is you take that length and you're cutting it maybe into squares or to smaller pieces. And I've got read in several patterns before where I thought I had everything cut ready to go, and then I got to an instruction that said, okay, take these pieces, and I go, wait, I don't have any pieces that size. And then I discovered that they had left out a subcut, or I missed it when I was cutting all the fabric. And sometimes that can be dangerous because sometimes you've used up fabric, you haven't cut it economically, and you don't have enough. And then you're kind of screwed at that point. You hope you can get more of that fabric real quick from that. So there's a combination of things there. It goes back to reading the pattern all the way through, but also making sure you have everything that you need. What about...
Well, garment sewing, usually, like if you buy a paper pattern, which I don't usually do, I usually buy a PDF pattern, but like this is a sample of a paper pattern. And on the back of it, you can see all these numbers and stuff like that. And that shows you all the different sizes that are available in the pattern for like a garment. And then at the top, they show you what materials you need to buy. And they also give you an estimation as to how much fabric you should buy for each size. So that's a really good example. On a PDF pattern, if you buy a PDF pattern, you print, it usually has it in the PDF pattern as a download again. And they also suggest, because you're making a garment, you have a little bit wider choice of fabrics than if you're doing a quilt. So they will also make suggestions as to what kind of fabric to use as well. So that's great on these kind of patterns. And what we were saying before, about cutting it out. Inside the patterns that they give you, they also give you a sample of how to lay out your pieces. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? Lay out your pieces on your fabric to cut them out as well. So that's kind of handy for that. I personally always like to have a little extra fabric, more than what is suggested in the pattern, only because I tend not to be too efficient at cutting it. And if I make a mistake when I'm cutting it, I always have some extra fabric.
Yeah, I do the same thing, but you're talking about a layout diagram kind of thing, show you how to cut your fabric on, get the most out of what you have bought. And they do that sometimes in quilting patterns as well, especially quilt patterns that may be cutting pieces from fat quarters. One I'm working on right now. they had a diagram showing you exactly how to get all the pieces you needed out of those fat quarters so that there was very little waste. I tend to do the same thing. Well, I don't tend to. I always do. I always buy more fabric than I need because I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. And I'll be really honest about it. I look at some of those diagrams and the way they've laid it out, and they don't make a lot of sense to me. I know what they're doing, but the actual physical cutting doesn't
the
work that
patterns
well.
they show there. Sometimes I just find that it's difficult to lay out my pieces on the fabric the way they have it shown.
So, I mean, I could spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like a jigsaw puzzle, how to get all these pieces to work on this one certain size piece of fabric. If I have extra fabric, I don't care.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm always
not efficient.
No,
I
I'm
don't
not efficient either.
Following the little diagram.
No.
I mean, I'd rather spend the extra little bit of money to have the ability to do whatever I want.
Of course, having said that, again, it depends on the fabric you're using. You know, if you got a dress pattern or something like that you're making out of very, very expensive fabric, you probably aren't going to buy a lot of extra of that. So those diagrams then in that case I think would be
the other problem you have is if your fabric is directional and you want the picture or whatever or the fabric that you've got going a certain way, you may have to buy extra fabric because you can't lay out your pieces to cut in the way that is shown on the diagram. It also depends on how stretchy your fabric is and where the stretch has to be and everything.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's more not rare, but less of a problem for quilt makers. But for garment makers, the direction of the pattern is probably very, very important with it. I mean, if you're doing a skirt and you've got little heads of animals on it, you don't want their bottoms up.
You don't want some of them going upright and the other ones going upside down. It just doesn't work.
And also in quilt making too, if you have a pattern that you're trying to preserve the look of it, like it'll look stupid if you sew two pieces together and you cut off the head of an animal or of a character or something like that, then what we call that is fussy cutting. And that's when direction of the fabric is very, very important. And oftentimes they will tell you that in your instructions in quilting. If you're using directional prints, make sure that you cut in a certain way with that. So you should get to know the creator or the publisher of the patterns that you buy because they're not all written the same way. I'll give you an example. One company that makes excellent patterns, they're easy to follow, they're very clear, they're very logical, is Cozy Quilt Patterns. I've done a lot of their quilts. Jordan Fabrics on YouTube, they do a lot of cozy quilt patterns as well, and they say the same thing. They're always very clearly written. However, I did a quilt a couple of years ago that was a quilt that was designed for Canada's 150th anniversary. And I will say the name of the designer, and I'm not trying to say that this designer is a bad designer. I just think this designer is not very clear in the way they write patterns. And that goes by Tamara Kate. It was a very large, it was a paper pieced pattern to make a very multicolored maple leaf. It was hell. Not to sew it together. That wasn't the hell. The hell was understanding the instructions. Now, I will say that I had not at that point had a lot of experience with foundation paper piecing. So part of the problem may have been my lack of experience, but there was definitely, looking at it from the point of view as an English teacher, the syntax of the sentences was horrible. So anyways, I was going to answer the phone. You probably heard it ringing in the background, but it's hung up. So it's probably somebody wants to clean my ducks. So I'm not going to worry about that because I don't have any ducks left. We ate them. Okay, so know your pattern publisher. Now, you were saying something about Vogue patterns.
Well, I don't know. I haven't really done a vogue pattern, but I went into a class earlier this year, and there was some discussion about patterns and their instructions, and one of them came up was vogue, and that vogue is can be a difficult pattern to follow. So I don't really have any experience with it, but I just heard this from the instructor of the class that had said that sometimes the vogue patterns are difficult to follow. So on men's clothing anyway. So I don't know that if that's a fact or not, but that's just what I heard type of thing. I do know that on some of the a couple of there's about 3 manufacturers that I've made clothes from, and I usually do it through a class, but I have gone back to look at the patterns to see how they were written, and I know that there's been complaints about one of the manufacturers that that produces the patterns that they're sometimes difficult to follow. But I found that 2 of the ones that I have that I really do like, the for the most part, from what I've seen for the instructions, they're actually very good. So it really varies depending on what kind of manufacturer you have.
Well, the other thing too is you have publishers of patterns and you have the writers of the patterns. So within a certain publishing company, they may have several different pattern writers, and so they're not all the same with it. And so then again, that's where I say know your designer as well. Now, the other thing you can do that'll help you with a problem like that is read the pattern thoroughly through and do the things I mentioned before. Highlight problems, go and do some more research about all that. But yeah, there are just some very terribly written patterns. I'll give you another example of terribly written patterns, but this is done on purpose. Missouri Star Quilt. If you go and get a free pattern from Missouri Star Quilt that they've done a tutorial on, you will get bare bone instructions. Now, the reason they do that is because they've already done a video tutorial. And so they explain it step by step through the video tutorial. But I have tried to make some of their quilts without watching the tutorial, and no, there's not enough information in those. Now, however, the ones they put in Block Magazine, their magazine, are always very, very well written, I have found. I've never had any problems with those except, well, one. And it just did not come out to the measurements they said it was supposed to. And ironically, I watched a video of Jenny Doan doing this particular pattern, and she had the same problem, and she skipped over it. I think you could see it in her eyes. She went, wait, this isn't coming. Okay, we'll just move on with that. It wasn't a major problem, but it was a frustrating problem.
I mean, there's sometimes in patterns that you might come across something in a pattern that you've done before on a different pattern or something like that. And the way the pattern is explaining it on how to do it is not maybe the way you're used to doing it. There's nothing saying you can't just change what you're doing and do it the way you're used to doing it rather than following your pattern exactly. So long as you're sure that you're not going to screw up the rest of the pattern when you're doing it. But I mean, there are a few things sometimes where patterns, the way they're written, may not be doing it as in logical sequences that what you're used to. So
no, and that's true in quilting patterns too. I mean, they may tell you to make 100 half square triangles, and they'll show you what the method they like to use. But I make my half square triangles in a way that I find more efficient, that I like to use. So I will look at what they're saying to do, but I will often do my own thing because it works better for me, and the end result is exactly the same. You'll also find this in quilt patterns where they're trying to sell you certain products, certain rulers. There are hundreds of different types of rulers and templates for quilting. And I have bought a lot of those, and a lot of times they're one-offs. But in a lot of cases, with the supplies you already have, you can use a ruler you already have to get the same result. So you might want to think about that. Again, if you're just starting out, it might be wise for you to make the investment in the ruler that they're suggesting for the best results. But as time goes by, you're going to find that you probably have something that will do the same job. So keep that in mind.
Or if you're new at making clothing or something like that, and you've never done a certain technique or something, you may just want to follow what the pattern is because you've never done it before.
Well, yeah. And that's in the case. I will buy rulers and templates if it's something I have never done before. And yeah, it gets up there because rulers aren't cheap. But, well, if you want the end result to turn out well, then you might be worth the investment. But you just have to check it. Again, it has to do with your level of experience, and it has to do with what you have in your stash of supplies. Okay, so organizing. Organize your pieces in a way that makes sense to you and will allow you to construct efficiently. And this means going beyond the pattern. I have not read too many patterns that have turned around and said to me or told me how I should lay out things, what order. Well, they do have the order you should do things in, but sometimes there is a better way to make it more efficient. For example, chain piecing. And chain piecing, if you're new to quilting, means you're sewing the same thing on multiple pieces, so you're just shoving them through your sewing machine. Like if you've got a whole bunch of half square triangles to make, rather than each block or each square of a half square triangle doing what you have to do, sewing the diagonal line, cutting off a quarter inch on either side, that kind of thing, and then now putting the next one through. You can sew all those diagonal lines one right after the other. But that means you got to keep yourself organized. And it helps if you've got a small design board. And what that is basically what works really well is a blank canvas that you can buy, and you cover it with some batting or some flannel and just staple gun it, pull it around the edges of it, staple gun it at the back, and then you can lay out your block pieces and do them that way. So you've got your pile of, if all the blocks are the same and you sew them the same way, then you can lay out all of your pieces for each row on top of each other, and you just go to town through it. That makes things more efficient. It makes it faster because this is probably tedious sewing that you're doing at that point. It's just, zip through. But have everything organized so you're not looking for it. Because you know what? If you don't organize your stuff and you go looking for your rotary cutter or your scissors or whatever, you won't find it. It will be buried under your fabric and everything else. It doesn't take much for these things to crawl away and hide on you. So I like to keep everything organized on my cutting table and know what I'm doing first, what I'm doing second, what I'm doing third. And I will make notes. Don't be afraid to make notes in the margins of your pattern, or get yourself a little pad or a notebook and, write things out for yourself as well. Whatever gets you through the project and gives you the least amount of frustration. And hang on to those notes. If you're going to hang on to the pattern afterwards, in case you ever want to make that one again, put those notes right in with your pattern when you store it.
I do that with buttonholes. I got a setting I like on the machine for buttonholes that has the density of stitching and stuff like that on there, and I keep it with my buttonholer so that I know every time I use a buttonholer to just set up the machine for that size, and I know right away that that's what I need. Sometimes on my pattern pieces I'll write notes like on pocket pieces. I'll write pocket placement side where the placement of the pocket's supposed to be and stuff like that, just so that I know the next time around where I got to put the pocket type of thing.
Yeah, because you won't remember.
No.
And especially when you're doing a lot of different projects over time and you come back to one you haven't seen in 6 months, a year, or longer.
That's if I reuse a pattern to make a second shirt or something like that. So I often do that, and I may make little notes if there's instructions on something on a piece. I'll just write it on the piece if there's a special instruction or something like that, just so that I remember the next time around if there's something that I really want to remember.
Now, the other thing you can do, which is an extension to that, is at least in quilt making, you will learn a new technique or a new way to do something that you've never tried before and you really like it. Well, don't just note that on the pattern itself, because depending on how you file away your patterns, whatever, have a journal. I have a quilt journal and I keep all kinds of things in it, but one of the sections in it is notes about techniques. And it'll briefly outline the technique, or in some cases, I just photocopy it and glue it in as well, or I will refer to the pattern. See such and such a pattern for this technique. This worked really well, or something like that. So, taking notes is not a bad thing when you're working with whatever you're sewing with it, because who knows? If you make that thing again, you're not going to remember. You won't. There's no two ways about it. Okay, so we've already talked. I had my next point here, but we've talked about this. Check the suggested difficulty level before you purchase. So we've already talked about that. Another point though, if you find you're getting frustrated with a pattern, stop. Stop. And go away. Because I have found the more frustrated I get, the more mistakes I make and the more aggravation, because I'm ripping out stuff, or as some people like to call it, I'm unsewing pieces from it. And I get so frustrated, the more that I work at it, the more mistakes I make, and it's just not worth it. Walk away. Or if it's something you don't understand and you've tried everything, your brain is getting muddled, walk away for a few minutes, an hour, leave it for the day, come back to it the next day. It's amazing how much clarity you will have if you leave it for a day and you come back to it and go, oh, all right, I get it now. I see that. What were you going to say?
Yeah, well, it's the same. Some people have off days, and you're doing something, and no matter what you do, it doesn't work right for you. So sometimes it's good to put it down, rather than trying to fight through it.
Yeah, you could be distracted by something else. I was working on a project the other day during Craft and Chat, and I was ripping pieces out because my focus wasn't where it was supposed to be, and I was getting frustrated. And it wasn't something that was difficult, shouldn't have been difficult, but because I was distracted. So that's another thing, when you're trying to study a pattern or work its way through, try not to do it when you're don't try multitasking. First of all, I don't care what anybody says. No human being on this planet can multitask. No, Don't give me that thing that women are good at it and men suck. No. Nobody can multitask. Not efficiently, not so that whatever they're working on is 100% accurate.
You could just do two things good separately.
Yeah.
Or two things half-assed.
Half-assed together. Yeah, with it all. So what else did you have? That's what I had.
No, I just that some manufacturers will leave out key things in patterns with the assumption that you know how you're an experienced garment seller and know how things go. Like there was an example shown to me about a sleeve. When you put in a sleeve, the sleeve has a front and a back to it. And normally, on most patterns, they notch the sleeves so that you can see which is the front and which is the back. Front usually has a single notch and the back usually has two notches. Well, this particular pattern maker or whatever left the notches off. And there was a pattern tester I knew that was working for this designer and said, you left the notches off the sleeve.
Talk to the designer.
To the designer of the pattern. And the response was, so an experienced sewer should know what the front and the back sleeve is. I still don't know what the front and the back sleeve is if I don't have the notches. So,
and you see, there's an attitude right there from the designer. They really don't care about the person. They want to sell the pattern and that's it. End of it. They don't really
want to
care.
go back and have to revamp their pattern because it's too difficult or something like
and
that.
What was the name of this designer?
It's Wardrobe by Me. I've done quite a few of their patterns. And apparently there's lots of stuff that the pattern manufacturer has left off. It's their patterns are interesting and unique and everything, but you have to be careful about how you read their patterns. And
the reason I asked you to say their name was as we are calling these ones out. We're not going to pretend just because that they're making money from this or whatever.
It's a European designer that has put out PDF patterns And they do have some interesting patterns, and I have done quite a few of their patterns, but I've done it through an instructor, and the instructor has said they've had to improvise on the patterns because things have been left out.
And you know, I think it's important not to just let those things go. I think it's important that if you can, reach out to the designer, the publisher, whatever, and say, look, I worked on this. I'm not an amateur. I had this problem and this problem and this problem. Because first of all, a lot of them will make corrections in their patterns, or they'll send out an addendum or put it up on a website so people can see that there was a problem. And oftentimes, I have bought patterns where they say, please check our website because we update any mistakes that we have found in the pattern. So before you do the pattern, check that out. And that is of great help. And ones that are really responsible pattern creators and that, they want to know what those mistakes are, what things are. They want to correct them because they want you to be a repeat customer. The ones who don't answer you back or do not provide you with corrections or anything like that, I don't think I buy another pattern from them.
Now, I have bought patterns that I think are really, really good. There's one called Sinclair Patterns. They produce PDF patterns, and they have really good tutorials on how to put things together. Like, I mean, to the point where it's really easy to sew. There's another company that I bought patterns from. They sell them in both tissue patterns, and some of them are also available as PDF.
They sell them in both tissue pattern
and PDF pattern.
Okay. Finish the sentence.
And not all the patterns are in PDF format. Some are only in tissue. And it's called a place called Thread Theory, and they're located in Canada. And this is a sample of their paper pattern. They're really good. They do mail order and things like that. There's another company called Sinclair that produces patterns. There's another company that some of the women might be familiar with called Mimi G. They do patterns. They also do some of their patterns are in PDF format as well. And with PDF format, what is really neat about it is that you can order it online, and you get it electronically sent to you, and you can print it off at home. And it's a little bit of a nuisance, but you can stick all the pages together to create the pattern, and then and just cut it out at home. That way you don't have to wait for the pattern to arrive or anything like that. You've got it right there. And if you need another copy of it, you can print another copy off, type of thing. Or actually, if you use the paper from your printer, it actually produces a fairly durable copy of the pattern. So, and the other neat thing about the PDF patterns is that they usually comes in a variety of sizes, and the PDFs come layered so that you can just print off the size that you require. So it just sort of it's kind of a neat way of doing things in this electronic age.
So what I want to show is all these things that Walter's just been talking about, certain names of places and whatnot. They will be in the show notes. So there'll be links to most of those. But I just want to show you here up on the screen. There's some links to 3 YouTube sections. This one is a playlist. It has it's all about reading patterns and understanding patterns, and it's not just for garment sewing, but there's a combination in here of both sewing garments and quilts as well. But some very good information there on how to read a sewing pattern. And I found another one, which is actually part of a course by many people are probably familiar with this particular YouTube channel, Quilt Addicts. And I'm not sure what her name is, I forget. She does a very good job of explaining in her first video in this series how you should dissect a pattern before you even start. And another good one I found was this one. It was How to Read Quilt Patterns, my first quilt, just by a YouTube channel called Quilt Videos. But I thought this one was very good as well. So those links are in the show notes below, along with some of the places Walter's been talking about too. So I guess the whole point of doing this episode on reading patterns is because when we first started into sewing, I mean, I certainly found it very confusing, trying to follow a pattern. Now it's old hat, but I still get tricked sometimes, because sometimes all the things, strategies I've just given you, I leave some of those out. Not a good idea. And I mean, I don't know about you, what your strategies and things. I'm sure you've learned quite a bit since.
Yeah, well, I'm not as organized as you, but what I often do
And
is,
yet you can still sew something. Amazing.
what I do is, if I cut out all my pieces for a shirt or something, I usually put them in a bag, all together in a bag, so I've got all the pieces in one place.
Well, that's a good point. I do that with quilt stuff too.
And with patterns, with shirt patterns and that, there aren't that many pieces, not as many as with a quilt, but it's nice to have all those pieces in one place, so that, especially some of the pieces can be kind of small. So you can, that everything I need for that project is in the bag. So
yeah, that's the same method that I use with quilts as well, to organize them. I clip them together. I put them in bags.
Because when I've been taking the classes for for garments and that, often in the class, all of a sudden somebody they'll say get this piece out or something, and they'll be hunting around all over the place for that one piece. Whereas somebody noticed that I pulled up a bag and just reached in and grabbed the piece out of it, and they said, well, you've got it all in a bag. I said, yeah, well, when I cut out all my pieces, I throw them in one bag and mark the bag what it's for. And I said, if I need a piece, I just go fishing around in the bag. So
yeah. So anyways, I hope that you found this helpful. I'm sure for those of you that might be just getting into sewing and quilting, this would definitely be a help to you. But I think sometimes some of these things, experienced sewers, they know this, but it's always good to review that, especially when you hit one of those challenging patterns that you're trying to figure out. So anyways, any final comments, words, things you want to say? No? Okay, so that's it for this episode of So Chatty. Hope you found it enjoyable, and I hope you learned something from it. And tune in next week. I don't know what we're talking about. I never know. So have a good week. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.